Hi, this is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art. In this episode, I'll be taking a live edge walnut slab and we'll be burning some rivers into it with high voltage electricity, pouring blue epoxy into those rivers to create a estuary charcuterie board. Depending on the design, I will either leave the live edges as natural as possible or I'll strip them bare. In this case, we're going to have infinity waterfalls going down both live edges. That means that we're going to be sanding the live edges, so there's no point in reserving every little feature. After removing most of the bark with a chisel, I'll use a direct drive sander with 80 grit. Even though we've stripped off the bark and we're lightly sanding the live edges, I don't want them to have any flat spots. I want them to look natural with all the curves and contours. I'm not being aggressive with the sander, really diving into it. I'm lightly skimming the surface and I'm changing my direction constantly. The goal is to just barely get down to the actual wood through all the bark. Once I have made it through all the bark, I'll switch over to a random oscillating sander, a little bit smaller at 5" compared to the last one, which was 6 inches. This will allow me to smooth out all the rough direct drive sand marks and get it ready for the burning process. Before I started burning this walnut slab, there was something I did that I didn't capture on video, which was surface the top and the bottom of the slab. The reason why I surfaced it before burning is so I've got a flat canvas to work with. The reason why I did this is because most of the rivers are going to be very shallow, less than 1/8 inch thick. If the surface was uneven, when I go to surface it flat later on, and then sanding, those rivers would just disappear completely. I will still lose quite a bit of the smallest rivers, but I'll maintain the medium and large rivers at the end. By the time I'm done burning this slab, it will no longer be flat. Due to the water and the heat produced by the electricity, it warps the wood. In addition, I will have several large rivers that go down the center, and anytime you remove material on the center, it just naturally wants to cup. On larger pieces such as dining room tables or coffee tables, I will actually pre-install steel C-channels underneath. Those C-channels will help hold the slab flat, even during the burning process. But even with those installed, they will still warp a little bit. My aim for this burning design was to have a couple large rivers down the center, and then tributary rivers that lead off of it. Using high voltage electricity and water, you never know exactly what you're going to get as far as a design or a layout. I do try and guide the electricity in the direction I want to go in, but it doesn't always cooperate. It will take the path of least resistance. Creating the initial rivers does take quite a bit of time. Once the main rivers are burnt in, the rest of them will speed up a little bit, but this whole process took me the better part of a day. Initially, even though I was trying to create some large rivers, you can see that the smaller tributary rivers will branch off. Once the electricity has found the ideal path, it will put all of its energy into that. The other ones will slowly die off, which leaves that branch-like lightning pattern behind. Most of those branches won't survive the finishing process, but the deeper ones will. As the rivers start getting closer to each other, the burning becomes more intense. Once they do connect, I will leave it burning until I get the desired depth that I want for that particular river. When finished, it looks like a piece that I threw into the fire, but once we sand off the top surface, the details in the rivers will be exposed. Once the wood has cooled down and there are no more burning embers, I will begin cleaning the slab by removing all the charred wood with a nylon wheel brush. The nylon wheel brush is equivalent to 120 grit. It's very effective without damaging the wood or the rivers. This does create quite the mess, and I found that using a vacuum with it cuts down on that quite a bit. This is another part of the process that is completely up to your imagination. I chose to remove just about all of the charred wood out of the large rivers and the small ones. That will give me the black outline that I want on the rivers, but also remove the charred wood so that blue epoxy in this case can be inlaid in there. I have in the past left quite a bit of the charred wood, blending it with the epoxy. It's just a different look, and for this one I want to be all blue without the black. I'm focusing only on the rivers at this point because I'll be running the slab through the drum sander surfacing off the top and bottom later on. It's very important to remove all the charred debris off of the slab, which includes the live edges where the infinity waterfalls are. This will ensure a good bond between the epoxy dams I'll be placing on the waterfalls during the epoxy pour process. The infinity waterfalls are just a continuation of the top surface burn that go down the live edges. I've found that burning the waterfalls on the live edge is very unpredictable. You can either end up with nice defined rivers, or you can end up with a patch that was just completely burned off. Now it's time to run it through the drum sander, starting at 80 grit and ending at 120. This can take several passes, and as I get closer to the desired thickness, I remove less each pass so that I can ensure that the smaller rivers are left behind. I wanted to go with a real rich blue for these rivers. Even though the primary color is going to be blue, I like to mix in other colors as well. I decided to add some teal, green, light blue, dark blue, some white pearl, and a few other colors. This will give the primary blue some depth once the pigments settle out after the epoxy pour. That will ensure that this color blue is very unique to this particular piece. In addition to the primary blue, I've also mixed up several other colors that I'll be introducing into the epoxy after the main primary blue pour. I prefer to start with the infinity waterfalls and fill those up before I start pouring the main rivers. I do this because they're going to get filled up anyhow as I pour in the center, but this way I can control the flow of the epoxy so that I get the colors just right. Each one of the waterfalls has been sealed off with tape and glue so that they won't leak. I try to isolate each waterfall individually instead of taping off the entire live edge. That helps reduce the amount of epoxy that's needed overall, but it also reduces the amount of sanding work they have to do once the seals come off. For now, I'm filling them all the way to the top using the primary blue epoxy, but I will come back later on with the auxiliary colors and mix those in as well. I try to pour the waterfalls as slow as possible so that air bubbles don't get trapped. That allows the air to come up as the epoxy goes down and limits the amount of bubbles that you have to repair later on. Once all of the waterfalls have been topped off, then I switch over to the main river system. First, I use that primary blue that we used on the waterfalls to fill all of the large, medium, small rivers on the entire top surface. It can be difficult to get the epoxy to flow just into the small tributary rivers, so sometimes I'll go back later on with a utensil and kind of scrape it in or dab it in. I'm paying close attention to how full the rivers are getting. I don't want them all the way to the top. I want them about halfway to 3/4 max. I still need to come back and pour 3 additional epoxy colors after this primary blue. So if it's too full, then it's just going to go up over the top, and I'm not going to get that blend of colors I'm looking for. If I do accidentally pour too much in a particular area, I can always spread it out and let the self-leveling epoxy do the rest. One of the things I always check before an epoxy pour is to make sure that my pour table is perfectly level, or at least as close as possible. If it wasn't level, then the epoxy would simply run to one side or one corner of the piece. Then you'd end up with areas that didn't have any epoxy at all, and others that overfilled. Since I'll be adding in additional colors to the primary blue, such as this dark blue in the center of the large river, it makes it that much more important that the colors stay right where I poured them and not flow off to one side of the piece. There are many different ways that you can blend the multiple colors together. More times than not, I'll use a utensil to create patterns in the epoxy, blending them by hand. But in this case, I'm just going to let the epoxy flow and run its course and kind of do more of a natural blend. As I'm pouring the dark blue, it appears just to be sitting in the center of the river, which creates a very distinct line. But in fact, once it settles down during the cure process, it will blend quite well. There will still be that dark blue that I want in the center, but it's not going to be a very distinct line anymore. I decided to go with a silver pearl with blue mixed into it for what I consider to be the shallow areas of this river system. There is no perfect method for making a resin art, so I just give it the best I can. If there's an area that has too much of a color, I can scoop it out or I can blend it over to another area. At the end of the day, I know what I want to achieve with these colors, and sometimes that takes a little bit of work to get it there. Once I finished pouring all the colors for this piece, I had to go back afterwards and tinker with it quite a bit. That's usually the case for every piece that has resin art, and it's just part of the process. There have only been a handful of times where I've had to remove all of the epoxy and start over, and that was many years ago, but it could always happen again. Once the epoxy is fully cured, then we're able to remove the dams. Notice how the epoxy has covered the live edge completely that was underneath the dam. That is why I tried to keep the dams localized just to a particular waterfall and not across the entire live edge. The tape comes off easy enough. I do use a heat gun to try to heat it up. It's a fine line between melting the tape and getting it to come off the epoxy, but it does work pretty well. The glue that's left behind that didn't come off of the tape, I just take a chisel and I lightly scrape it off without damaging the live edge. Once all the dams have been removed, I'll take a direct drive sander with 80 grit and I'll just knock down all the high areas left behind. The epoxy has a tendency to climb up the tape, which leaves a ridge line. This saves time when you run it through the drum sander by not having to do a couple extra passes. Depending on the piece and the design, I'll either run it through the drum sander or use the router surfacing table to flatten it. For this one I thought it'd be quicker just to use the drum sander since it's a smaller piece. Using a direct drive sander with 80 grit, I'll lightly take off the bulk excess of epoxy on the Infinity waterfalls. My goal here is just to get close to the live edge but not actually sand the wood. I don't want to create any flat spots or remove parts of the waterfalls that are meant to be there. The direct drive with 80 grit can easily carve out an area of the live edge that you didn't intend to, so I just very carefully skim over it. I'll switch over to a random oscillating sander with a 5-inch disc. It has a little bit extra flexibility and isn't prone to carve through that live edge. When the board came out of the drum sander, it was sanded to 120, but I'll actually use 120 grit on a random oscillating sander to work those grooves out left behind from the drum sander. Working my way up, I'll switch to 220, then 320, and ultimately 400 grit before finishing the top and the bottom of the board. Not seen in the video, I used a scroll saw to cut out the shape of the handle. From there I'll shape it by hand and then sand it to 400 grit. Using a router and a 3/8 bit, I'm rounding the edges both on the outside of the handle but also the inside, both top and bottom. Afterwards, I'll take a look and see if there are any voids or cracks that were exposed during the cutting process that need to be filled in with resin. Once any repairs were made that were needed, I'll sand those edges to 400 grit to match the rest of the board surface. Using a track saw with a fine-tooth blade for the epoxy, I'll trim the other edge. For any depth over 1 inch, I like to make 2 passes for the cut. That way it doesn't strain the blade and you get a nice clean trim. This once again might expose cracks that weren't initially filled in with the resin from the top surface. Once I made the repairs and sanded the edge to 400 grit, then I moved on to branding the bottom of the board. Every piece gets a brand on the bottom, whether it be a table or a charcuterie board. Each one is dated, signed, and has a piece number. I'll sand that brand to smooth it out and then move on to raising the grain. For this I just use water and a paper towel. I do make sure to clean the board off beforehand, both with a towel and also with an air bath. That way any leftover sanding material, whether it be wood or epoxy, doesn't cement down into the grain pockets. Once all the water is evaporated off, then it's time for the final sanding. Knocking down the grain with 400 grit and hitting all the surfaces. By 400 grit, you shouldn't see any random orbit scratches to the naked eye in the wood. They're going to blend all in. You will, however, notice them on the epoxy, and that's just how sanding epoxy goes. You really have to take it up to much higher grit to get rid of any random orbit scratches left behind. When it comes down to a matte finish on the wood, such as a mineral oil or liquid hard wax, it really does boil down to two options. The client can either go with a matte finish on the epoxy and wood, or they can go with a high gloss finish on the resin and keep that matte finish on the wood, which gives you a great contrast between the two. If the client chooses to go with a matte finish on the resin and the wood, well, then you go to 400 grit on the wood and call it a day. And the resin, you can play around with the grits. I like to go to about 800 grit on the resin with a wet sand, and that allows you to get rid of the random orbit scratches that you would visibly see, kind of giving it that fog look on the epoxy, and smooths it out. If the client wants to go with a high gloss finish on the resin, then there's a lot more steps involved. Either way, it starts with this step in the process of applying your finish oil. In this case, we're using a mineral oil because it's a food grade item. There are many ways to apply a food grade mineral oil. In this case, I'm using a 3-inch Scotch-Brite, which is the equivalent of about 400 grit, and I'm using a direct drive pneumatic tool to apply it on. The walnut hardwood is a little bit tougher than this epoxy, and I'm not necessarily trying to sand either surface at this point. The Scotch-Brite I'm using isn't really designed for that. What I'm trying to do is make sure that the mineral oil is really worked down into the walnut grain pores. This client did want a high gloss finish on the resin, so I want to make sure that when I switch over to wet sanding, I'm not going to sand through the layer of mineral oil that's in the walnut, so I want it to really penetrate down in there as far as possible. Once I do start the wet sand process to get that high gloss finish on the resin, it's impossible not to sand the surrounding walnut. The first 3 grits that I'll use for wet sanding are 500, 600, and 800. All 3 of those grits, especially the 500 and 600, will sand the walnut noticeably. To do that, I make sure to cover the entire surface of the walnut wherever there's resin, so all the sides and the top will get 500, 600, and 800 evenly across the entire piece. So long as I'm not applying too much pressure or sand too many passes, then I won't go through this layer of mineral oil that I'm applying right now. Once I'm finished with all the wet sanding and clean the board off, I will apply a couple last coats of mineral oil just to give it that good thick coat to go out the door. This is my favorite part of the process of applying the initial finish. You get to see the piece come to life, all the work that you've done up until this point. From the time of starting the process and going through the burning and the epoxy pour and finish sanding, it's hard to tell what the piece is going to look like until you get to this point. I always have an idea of what it should look like in my head, but until you get the finish on it and see it come alive, you're never quite sure what you're going to end up with. This just about concludes the video of making this piece. I didn't video the wet sand and polishing of the resin, but I will make future videos where I show that portion of the process. Basically, it's a lot of wet sanding and then you switch over to polishing, and there are many grits of both of those. So here we are with the final product. This is my personal favorite finish for just about every piece, is to have the wood be a natural matte and to have the high gloss on the resin. I believe the contrast between the matte finish on the wood and the high gloss resin complement each other. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video of making a estuary charcuterie board. My name is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel @Jeremy Elkins for future videos.